right, welcome everyone. Good evening for those of you on the East Coast. Late afternoon for those of the West Coast, and a very good late evening to those of us who are joining from the UK. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Ethan Marcus. I am the Director of Communications for the Sephardic Jewish Brotherhood of America. We're so glad to have you here for us for our fourth in our five-part series on Sephardic industry leaders for our Young Professionals program. Tonight, we'll be talking with Dr. Efrat Sopher, who is a member of the World Jewish Congress Diplomatic Corps, as well as a member of the Board of Deputies of British Jews, and a member of the board of the S&P Sephardic community, who we're so excited to have with us tonight, speaking about particularly politics in the Middle East and her role as a Jewish advocate globally. Just a little background, this is a part, for those who are joining us for the first time, this is a part of our Sephardic Digital Academy program, a national initiative dedicated to engaging Sephardic Jews through all different kinds of programming, whether it be history, Ladino language and culture courses, Sephardic Kashrut, Sephardic Halakha, Torah, and so much more. If you're interested in finding out more of our classes all through our Sephardic Digital Academy, please check out our website, sephardicbrotherhood.com/Sephardic Digital Academy. Now, just a few words on Dr. Sopher. Dr. Efrat Sopher earned her bachelor's degree from the University of Southern California and a master's degree from the London School of Economics and Political Science, both in international relations. Efrat earned a postgraduate diploma in law and practiced as a solicitor in London. Efrat earned a PhD in international relations at the London School of Economics and Political Science, specializing in Israeli foreign policy towards Iran from 1948 to 1979, and also examining the human element within foreign policy, strategic formation, and implementation. The PhD thesis revealed and analyzed documents that had previously been sealed from public view. Dr. Sopher has advised governments and organizations on foreign policy in the Middle East and beyond. She is an active member of the World Jewish Congress Diplomatic Corps and has represented the World Jewish Congress worldwide, including at the United Nations Human Rights Council. Efrat served as chair of the board of advisors at the Esri Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies, and serves on the executive committee of the HMS Maritime Policy and Strategy Research Center at the University of Haifa. Efrat sits on the board of the S&P Sephardic community, one of our sister communities, and is very active in steering and maintaining the welfare of the overall community. Dr. Sopher, thank you so much for being with us this evening.
Thank you so much for having me. It's the next best thing to traveling. So it's such a pleasure to see everyone and to travel across the pond.
Yeah, and a big thank you for staying up a bit late. For all of you who don't know, she's actually up in London time right now, so it's a bit later for her there than here. So we really appreciate sticking it out.
It's a pleasure. It's nothing coffee can't fix.
Arctic coffee, a Turkish coffee, perhaps.
Exactly right.
Yeah, get started. So you have a long history, background in Middle East affairs. Just tell us a little bit about some of the work you've done recently with the World Jewish Congress and advocacy.
So the advocacy work we do is quite diverse, which is something that I love, and that it's both diverse and interconnected at the same time. Something we've been working on a lot has been adopting the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. It's the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, which provides the most useful and enforceable ways to enforce against acts of anti-Semitism. So one of the things that I've been quite active with has been to approach governments. For example, the German government on engaging with them and seeing how the IRA definition affects voting, for example, in the United Nations. And so especially within the definition, the connection of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism is something that's quite important in implementing work on anti-Semitism. So, for example, having a dialogue with governments on why, for example, voting against Israel in the United Nations can be seen as anti-Semitic, because it's holding Israel to a double standard in its action in a way that no other state would be judged. And so that's something that I've been quite active in. And since COVID, we've been very active in supporting our communities across the world. So the World Jewish Congress is the representative body of Jewish communities in over 100 countries across the world. So it really does span. We have quite a wide network, which means that we can support our communities and use best practices to give them whatever support they need. One of my favorite things that have happened recently is the Abraham Accords. And so connections with the United Arab Emirates, with Bahrain, and with Sudan. And I think this is a very, very exciting development, which I look forward to working on further in establishing further connections with Jewish communities in the Middle East and the Gulf, especially since my own background is from that neighborhood. And so my family is originally from Iran, and my grandmother's family is originally from Syria, and so kind of very, very firmly Sephardi. And that's, maybe something that we can touch on later, but it is very, very, very moving to be able to do. I do a lot of work in Europe, in Russia, in kind of around the world, but when it comes to the Middle East, it really is something that's very, very near and dear to my heart. And so being able to it makes you feel at home when you're discussing all of these matters, because these are things that we've grown up with and mentalities that we've grown up with. And so to be able to make these connections with people from the Gulf and the Middle East within the scope of kind of my own work is really, really, really moving.
I want to touch on the point you mentioned about the recent Abraham Accords, which I think many of us know it's a major change in some of the dynamics in the Middle East, certainly a big step forward. Maybe you can touch a little bit upon kind of what has led us to this point where we've seen a changing dynamic, particularly among the Gulf states, but certainly among many Arab countries in the Middle East vis-a-vis the Jewish people and the state of Israel.
Yes, I mean, in the Esri Center and in the HMS Maritime Strategy Institute, we've been studying the Middle Eastern terrain for a very long time. And what has happened has been a real paradigm shift. I think where we see the biggest change is that the Gulf states have seen Iran as a major threat, a clear and present danger, and have seen Israel as a regional power that has capability to deter against Iranian aggression in the region and Iranian proxy capabilities. And also at the same time, I think that the Gulf governments have been quite brave and bold in pursuing their own foreign policies and in being the new emerging Arab leaders. And so they have managed to almost circumvent the conventional decision-making pattern of the Arab world, in that the Palestinian issue was the most pressing issue that was the step towards normalization within the region. But the Arab Gulf states have managed to circumvent that and have elected to normalize in a way that is really unique. It's very warm, and normalization is quite fast, which is fascinating to see. So, I mean, for example, have been able to make kind of very warm connections with Gulf academics, with other Gulf personalities, and in my institutes, I'm working on gaining connections and really being able to build bridges there, very warm bridges. And from the World Jewish Congress perspective, the Emirates Jewish communities have formally joined our organization. And so it's a very, very, very exciting developments, both from the Jewish level and from the from the international kind of state security level.
I'm curious, maybe you can touch a little bit more on your background. You mentioned how you're Persian and Syrian heritage, Jewish heritage. How much do you think that was a driver in you kind of joining, solely moving to the space, particularly on Middle East policy affairs?
It was a huge driver. It was, it's in the blood almost. And so my late grandfather, Meir Ezri, was sent by David Ben-Gurion to establish relations with Iran. So he was born in Iran and made Aliyah to Israel. And in 1958, he was asked by Ben-Gurion to go back to Iran and establish diplomatic relations. And so I grew up with these stories of how he managed to really win over the Iranian government and to establish trust and relations for kind of those who have who would want to know more about it. Relations were eventually very, very good with Iran. And so, for example, Israel imported almost 90% of their oil from Iran. There was a lot of military and intelligence sharing. There was a lot of agricultural exchanges, academic exchanges. And so it was a very warm relationship. It was never formalized, but it was warm and it was very present. For example, the Israeli embassy was one of the biggest embassies in the Middle East, the Israeli embassy in Teheran. And so I grew up with these stories, and studying international relations, I wanted to find out a way of marrying up the stories that I had heard growing up about all these incredible ways in which Israeli and Iranian diplomats almost reinvented the rule book in diplomatic relations. And the realpolitik explanation of kind of my enemy's enemy is my friend went only so far in explaining the quality of the relations between Israel and Iran. And so what I did during my PhD is to really chart and to try and explain how human relationships play a major role in foreign policy, which was fascinating because I got to chart academically and almost scientifically the way that human connections and the role of perceptions affect relationships between countries. And so it's bigger than just meeting a person. It's the trust that you establish, for example, that can lead to vital oil deals.
Folks, we seem to have lost her. Just a quick moment. Keep in mind, she is. Are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Sorry, we just lost you for a quick moment.
Oh.
No, you're back.
I'm back.
Great.
Yes, and so it's and working and having the Jewish element to whatever I do is something that I find very, very important, because I feel that it's our responsibility. It's our responsibility to almost use our talents and our insight and whatever we can to make sure that Jews are safer everywhere.
Now, you mentioned this element that I know in the diplomatic world, they kind of refer to as track 2 diplomacy. For those who don't know, track 1 is kind of the high level state to state conversation, and track 2 is much more of the people to people, as you mentioned, the kind of often academics conversations. How much do you think in the case of the Middle East, in the developments in the UAE, Sudan recently, potentially Morocco, we're seeing how these things go, Bahrain recently as well. How much do you see people to people track 2 diplomacy having an impact in these developments?
I feel that it's vital. Track 2 is very important. And I think track 2, without being too specific to any particular situation, track 2 I think helps to facilitate the track 1 diplomacy also. It is, again, it builds trust, it builds connections that almost help to circumvent an obstacle, a fear, to break down preconceived ideas. And this is something that's quite pervasive. It's not being naive or wishful thinking. It's amazing to see it in action, to see how people can really get to know each other in a way that that they wouldn't be able to do in for example in a big conference room. It's something that helps to facilitate the more formal negotiations on the state level. It really is like magic to watch.
Maybe you can speak to whether or not, in your personal experience or from your studies, what does it look like in the room when two diplomats from, let's say, opposing sides or from more adversaries, they come into the room, they've never had communications before. What does it look like? How do they get to, you know, from the point of conflict to the point of resolution?
That's a really good question. Thank you for asking that. It is fascinating because you also have, so one of the things that I love to do is to read the room. When you enter the room, you have to be very, very open, no matter where you are. You could be anywhere. And it's really to be open and to see, and again, not from a naive perspective, from a from an open perspective. In that, I think people read on that when you want to learn about where they're coming from and to learn about them. And so I think the visuals are quite important. I think that people do make judgments when someone sees another person, that plays a role. And you can actually see how they see each other, and you can almost see the processing that occurs where they see, well, they really are very much like me. And so years worth of indoctrination almost melt away. It's fascinating. And I was kind of somewhere in London, and I was talking with a kind of Palestinian counterpart, and we were talking and kind of joking about shakshuka, you know, lofty things, and and we were having a little argument about who had a better shakshuka, and being able to almost laugh about it broke down a lot of barriers. And he said, he actually verbalized, "I've never met an Israeli like you before." And so it's, to see that in practice is very, very special, because it helps when it comes to talking about the tougher points. At least you have some sort of dialogue. And so
Sorry about that. Looks like we just lost her again. Just give us 1 or 2 minutes. Apologize about that. Folks, we just lost her on our internet. We apologize for that. We're just getting her back on. Should just be a moment or two. Thank you.
Sorry, Ethan. Can
Not,
you hear me?
not a problem. We can hear you.
I'm so sorry. I don't know what happened there.
Not a problem at all. Yes, don't forget, everyone, the magic of technology is amazing, but an ocean is an ocean. So we sometimes have technical difficulties that happen.
The ocean, yes.
Wonderful. So where were we? So I'm also curious if you can maybe touch upon some of your experiences with anti-Semitism in the UK, particularly your activism with the Board of Deputies and also the Sephardic community there, and kind of some of the challenges you're facing there today. Particularly in the government, there's been challenges in government and also in civil society.
Yes, this is something that the Board of Deputies was very active with, as well as the kind of World Jewish Congress via the Board of Deputies. We had the very clear and present danger posed by Jeremy Corbyn, the head of the opposition party. And it was, and Corbyn, if for our viewers who may not have been following, was putting out virulently anti-Semitic rhetoric, masked as a critique on the Israeli government. And for the first time in a very, very long time, almost everyone in the Jewish community felt very, very threatened. We were actually, I mean, me and all my friends were having the dinner party conversation was, where are you going if Corbyn comes into power? And so for the first time again in a long time, Jewish organizations got together and protested and approached the government, and a couple of weeks ago a big inquiry on anti-Semitism within the Labour Party came out, and really provided a damning report of inherent anti-Semitism within the Labour Party, and Jeremy Corbyn was finally suspended. And so the Jewish community really breathed a sigh of relief, both when the Conservative Party and Boris Johnson were elected by a landslide several months ago, but also by the report that came out, really vindicating the threat that the Jewish community felt. And so this was something that all communities felt, really, both Ashkenazi and Sephardi. And so we at the SMP Sephardi community were also very much a part of this, and were quite active in trying to kind of thwart that threat.
Building off of that, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what we've seen recently in Europe and now in the United States, unfortunately, is the rise of this populist anti-Semitism, both on the right and the left, right? It's not just exclusive to any one political sphere, and how, at least in the UK and also by the World Jewish Congress, how you're kind of combating this, especially at a very volatile time in Jewish community relations and just international relations.
It keeps us very busy. Anti-Semitism is very, very much on the rise, unfortunately. And so we've seen it in all sorts of guises. So we've seen it within the coronavirus context, where traditionally anti-Semitic tropes have been coming out again, which has been very, very worrying. And from the kind of general anti-Semitism coming both from the left and the right, we've had to battle it on the policy level. Engaging with governments around the world to help us battle that. And again, that's where the IRA definition of anti-Semitism makes it, it's a very handy tool in being able to pinpoint what is anti-Semitic. And it trickles down from voting at the UN, like I said, to, for example, teaching police how to enforce actions against anti-Semitism. And so we've been engaging with working very closely with governments throughout Europe and throughout the world to remedy that. And also on a more grassroots level, we've had social media campaigns, we've had different outreach, diplomatic outreach programs also, where my colleagues and I reach out to embassies across the world to alert them to the growing problem of anti-Semitism. And so we find that both from the micro level and the macro level, governments do, thank goodness, work with us on battling anti-Semitism. And it's, you know, it's a never-ending battle, sadly, but I think at least it's important that we have a voice and that we do something about it. So it spans from the educational side to the grassroots side to the kind of high-level government side, where, you know, one would reach out to the leader, to the prime minister, or to the president, or to whatever minister, or we've worked very closely with the commissioners on anti-Semitism. So, for example, with Ilan Carr in the United States, and and his European counterparts, and with, for example, here in the UK with Lord Pickles. And so, again, also human relationships are something that I find are very, very, very important. When one builds on those relationships and establishes trust and a good working relationship, it makes battling, you know, anti-Semitism a bit more of a smoother process.
And we're going to open up the questions in just a few moments. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to put in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. I'm curious, Efrat, also, maybe you can speak about being a Sephardic Jew in this world, because it's a relatively unique placement. You're a minority within a minority, and certainly within the World Jewish Congress and other Jewish advocacy groups globally, it's certainly, there's not so many of us. So I'm curious, maybe you can speak about your experience as a Sephardic Jew, identifying as one and advocating for Sephardic communities as a whole.
Again, that's a really good question, because yes, when I do find myself in these kind of forums, I am in a minority. I think luckily I went to an Ashkenazi day school. Our brilliant Sephardi school wasn't open yet, that my boys go to. So I'm very well versed in the Ashkenazi world, which helps. But luckily, my Sephardi identity is super strong. And so I find that it gives me a different perspective, almost I come in from a slightly different angle. It has to do also, I think, a little bit with maybe it's coming in from a different angle. So, for example, if I'm speaking with kind of German colleagues, we can compare notes on our levels of threat perception. It has to do with kind of tapping into our histories. And so the way I would relate to an Iranian threat, maybe a bit, you know, have a slightly different flavor to it than you know, a European counterpart, and vice versa, which means that we can work together at approaching a common issue that we're working on from a different perspective. So, for example, if we're working on, I was working on a campaign to have Hezbollah designated a terrorist organization around the world. And I think that my kind of specialist regional knowledge came in quite useful, because I was able to explain and articulate the mindset in a more real and preemptive way, because this is a region that I know very, very well, not just academically. And so it's it's an interesting place to be when you're at an international conference and you are in the minority. And I think it's very much a responsibility also, because within the Jewish world, you're able to explain yourself and to be almost the window into the Sephardic world, where, I mean, I haven't seen it ever be a barrier, but it's always an opportunity. It's an opportunity for people to get to know each other and to understand each other and to work on a common goal. And also what I've found has been interesting is that we're able to discuss ideas and our philosophies, which is one of my favorite parts. So kind of beyond the cuisine and the cultural stuff, it's the philosophical ideas that are fascinating to discuss with my Ashkenazi colleagues.
Thank you so much. We're going to jump right into the questions from the chat. We have a couple of great questions already, so thank you all so much. And if you have other questions that come up, please feel free to write them in. First question, out of curiosity, someone's curious, how many languages do you speak? And then as a follow-up, what are your thoughts? There's been some advocacy in Israel that the prime minister and or president should actually speak fluent Arabic out of respect for the minority community of Arabic speakers. What are your thoughts on that?
So languages are very important. I speak Hebrew, English, French, Farsi, and a tiny bit of Russian. They're very, 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 very important. Because again, you're able to connect with people. And I think so as I was saying, when I spoke at the UN, that was when our connection went down. So when I spoke at the UN, I was talking about the story of Purim, and after the speech, some Iranians approached and wanted a little chat. And so I don't think they'd met an Israeli before, or someone Jewish. And I was able to speak with them in Farsi and explain about my speech. And I was able to make a proper connection with them. And that's something that I think was partly due to being able to speak Farsi. The point on Israeli leaders being able to speak Arabic, I think they must be able to speak Arabic, but I think, yes, and when the context fits, to modify and to, I believe that most Israeli leaders do speak Arabic. Also, it's part of the Israeli educational system. But I think, you know, when speaking at formal Israeli events, I think Hebrew is quite possibly the most appropriate language to use. But again, it fits the context, and every context is different.
That's an interesting question over here. Some of the nations we mentioned before that have been in the region that have been kind of developing closer ties with Israel have some difficult human rights records and difficult histories. How does Israel kind of balance these and avoid the image of potentially even being seen as affiliated with these kinds of human rights violations?
Excellent question. And this was something that that came up in my research on Israel and Iran, where there were critics of the Pahlavi regime. But I think, in a way, Israel needs to look after its own strategic interests. I think human rights, of course, plays a part in, you know, every nation's calculus. But I think that establishing relationships first helps us to engage with these governments and to have a dialogue. I think to a certain extent there are limitations in what you can kind of dictate to other countries, but I think I'm a big believer in leading by example in a way, and that Israel is the only kind of properly functioning democracy in the Middle East. And call me old-fashioned, but I really do believe in kind of the light unto the nations doctrine, where you lead by example and hopefully demonstrate that that the way we function is a way that kind of works for us. On the other hand, it's a bit more complex than that, because, for example, that there are countries where Iranian proxies would get into control if there were to be if there could be a takeover, for example, by Iranian proxies, if traditional democratic process were to be followed right now. So I think it's all on based on context again, and I think we should be very keen to make relationships with countries that want to normalize their relations with us. It's for the benefit of Israel and of Jewry.
A question about your personal experiences, particularly as a woman in diplomacy. Have you seen your opinions taken seriously? And have you ever been challenged? Certainly, it's always challenging with gender roles, but have you ever been challenged dealing with I would say, a male-dominated field and trying to break through those challenges?
Thank you for that question. I find that when I was thinking about it, of the kind of career that I'd want to have, I was aware that women are in a minority. And I think that kind of having a doctor in front of your name helps a lot. It almost kind of gives you immediate validation before, so people have seen that you've done your work. And yes, people have a kind of preconceived notion of what your aspirations are, where you want to take your career. And I think you kind of lead by example, and you almost have to work extra hard and engage extra hard. And one of the things that I always say to women starting out in my field is to be yourself. You don't have to kind of almost assume a male identity. I think women have to be themselves, and they can navigate the diplomatic world in a strong feminine way. And so it's fascinating to see, and I find that women almost give a different perspective again. And so working with men on a project, I mean, it's not as clear cut, I think, as it used to be, and it's a lot more subtle, but it makes it a very, very interesting experience. And so, I mean, I would definitely encourage women to enter this industry. It's fascinating and challenging and very, very educational.
As a follow-up question to that, do you see voices of women in the Middle East being more accepted over the past kind of 20, 30 years with more modernizations and Western exposure? What does that look like?
It's wonderful, especially in the Gulf, where you see women, for example, in the United Arab Emirates and in Bahrain, where there are even kind of Jewish women representatives. For example, in Bahrain, there's Huda Nunu, the former Bahraini ambassador to the US. There's Nancy Kadoorie, who's the Jewish Shura Council member in Bahrain. And within the United Arab Emirates, there are women who are active members of the foreign ministry. It makes for a very, very interesting dialogue. It's almost, again, it's breaking stereotypes, because one would think, coming from the West, that women wouldn't have access to the same education, or wouldn't have access to the same career and opportunities. And again, I find that as a Sephardic woman, in this world, it lends a certain familiarity where you can connect with these ladies, again, on a very human level, and connect very quickly. And so I welcome that, and I always relish kind of meeting women counterparts. It's great.
Another question here from the chat. As someone who is multilingual and has an array of backgrounds, no less in an international city like London, do you recommend, or do you advocate for teaching children Hebrew or their native country's language or their country of origin, Arabic, Farsi, Ladino? What do you personally prioritize, you think, and the communities as a whole should prioritize in terms of language instruction?
That is brilliant. The questions today are just staggeringly brilliant. I think Hebrew is very, very important. I think Hebrew is a priority both for kind of religion, for tefillah, and for being able to converse in anything Israeli. And I find that it's part of our identity, which is very, very important. And knowing our original languages, I think it is also, I think the more the merrier. And being able to speak Farsi or Ladino or Arabic is something that is very useful. I never imagined that it would come in as useful as it has. And so each language is an absolute asset, most definitely. And priority-wise, I don't know. In my own family, Hebrew was always a priority. And then extra languages were encouraged. But the more the merrier, absolutely.
Now, you were originally born in Israel, correct?
Yes, correct.
Yes. So maybe there's a question here regarding your experience as a Sephardic Jew in Israel. And growing up there, what was your experience? Did you experience any type of discrimination or challenges being Sephardic or of Persian heritage? Because often we read, at least in the early days of the state, and certainly even today, there were many challenges from the Ashkenazic majority, against the Sephardic and Mizrahi minority.
Yeah, that's something that I am hoping to study within the kind of foreign policy making apparatus. Have I experienced it personally? Not really. No, I can't say I have, but I am aware that historically, and again, you know, the Persian community, the Sephardic communities have experienced discrimination, and it's something that I think is being redressed kind of eventually, because it's such a subtle phenomenon. It's become more and more subtle. It was a lot more obvious before. I'll tell you a little story that came up in my research that I knew of, but then I found the documents. So they were trying to appoint a military attaché in Iran, in the Israeli embassy in Iran. And the foreign ministry, which was very, very Ashkenazi, wanted to send their own man. And the Iranians and the Israeli diplomats on the ground in Tehran wanted to recruit an attaché, a soldier of Iraqi origin, Israeli Iraqi origin. And in order to kind of influence the foreign ministry back in Jerusalem, they worked there with the Iranian foreign ministry counterparts and sent a letter to the Israeli foreign ministry and requested that they send someone with the exact criteria that the Israeli Iraqi officer filled. And so that's how they managed to work together to get him sent to Tehran. And it was, you know, he helped form part of a very important relationship. And so I think that's something that that the Israeli government, I think, is realizing and appreciating more and more, that Sephardi Jews do have kind of a home background and can really, really add value. So for example, like my late grandfather was of Iranian, he was Iranian born and was really knew the Iranian mentality from within. And that had a huge impact on foreign policy making and foreign policy execution. And so it's a really valuable advantage that Israel has with all its immigrants from around the world.
Another question here from the chat. And again, if you have any additional questions, please feel free to enter them in the chat. Maybe you can talk a little about, from your perspective, Israeli-Palestinian relations today and where they're going, because as we've seen in the past 15, 20 years, any peace process sort of stalled through different cycles, obviously, but where do you see it going? And what do you think the prospects are of a long-term peace agreement?
I think that the Abraham Accords have, again, have transformed the paradigm. And I think in the long run, it will make an agreement with the Palestinian people a lot more tenable, simply because of the expectations of the Palestinian leadership. I think that the Palestinian leadership has kind of held their own people hostage for a very long time and has kind of held them to a victim mentality, which has probably served the leadership well, but has not served the people in a way that I feel any leaders should. And so I think in the long run, it will make negotiating with the Palestinians a lot more real, a lot more realistic, and a lot more productive. It was interesting that this week the Knesset voted on the accords with Bahrain, and it passed with an overwhelming majority. The only dissenters in that vote were the Arab parties, the Palestinian parties, and so it's indicative of that kind of rejection of hope in a way. And I'm hoping that as the Abraham Accords become more and more normalized, the Palestinian people will see the benefit in genuine negotiation and in changing the mindset, their own mindset, for a brighter future in the Middle East. Because I really do, call me a dreamer, but I do feel that it is possible to a certain extent, only if people have a realistic look of where things can go.
We have a fun question here. If you've seen the recent series Teheran, and if that reflects, it accurately reflects Persian experience.
Well, I love Teheran. It's a brilliant show. I don't know if you've seen it, Ethan.
I personally haven't, so I can't speak to it.
Okay, it's very good, and it was lovely to hear so much Farsi. Whether it's realistic at all, the Persian was very realistic. I can't really kind of comment on anything substantive. It made a brilliantly entertaining show, is what I can say. It's well worth a watch, and very interesting to see kind of Iranians portrayed, to start a dialogue on how we relate to Iran and to Iranians, because I think, the Iranian people themselves are, people that we can absolutely relate to. The leadership, the government is a malignant presence in the region and poses an existential threat. But the people themselves we have a lot more in common with them than differences. But it's a great show, well worth watching.
On that note, actually, another great question just came up. can you speak maybe to a little bit how the World Jewish Congress interacts with, particularly Iran in this case, the Jewish, there is still a minority Jewish community in Iran today. They're not totally exposed to the wider Jewish world. How does the World Jewish Congress and kind of these advocacy groups work with these communities in states where we may have difficult relationships with the actual national governments, but still wants to make sure that the communities are supported in some capacity?
So the way the World Jewish Congress approaches any community is we follow the lead of the community themselves. And I can't really comment on how we approach vulnerable communities, but we always take into consideration the safety of the Jewish community in situ. And so that can be, in Iran, it can be in Venezuela, it could be, it's the safety of the community itself is always paramount. And so we have to kind of consider that whenever we act. And so luckily we have affiliates around the world. And so we tread very, very carefully, and are always, we have to be mindful of the safety and security of the local community, and do what we can to help.
Let's see, we have one or two last questions here because I know it is late, and I do want to thank Efrat so much again for staying up so late in London time.
My pleasure. It's really my pleasure.
Today, I'm curious specifically about your experience in the UK and the Sephardic community there. For those who don't know, the S&P Sephardic community is actually one of the oldest Jewish institutions in the UK itself. The Sephardic Jews were actually one of the original returnees to the United Kingdom after the original expulsion from England in the 1200s. But the S&P was really founded by the Spanish and Portuguese of Western Europe. You yourself are from Persian heritage, and many of the Jews today are from a diverse background. We have one synagogue, for example, in Holland Park, that's a Turkish and Greek background. How has the integration worked from kind of a central community standpoint, where you have the traditional Western Sephardic Jews, you have the Turkish, you have the Persian, you have the kind of melting pot of pan-Sephardic Jews, I would say. How has that kind of worked and functioned?
I have found it really interesting because coming almost as an outsider to the SMP has been fascinating. It's and I think this is something that kind of serving on the board of SMP, ironically, is something that's fascinating. It's almost upholding the SMP values, the SMP philosophy, the Spanish and Portuguese philosophy, and having to integrate and welcome other communities also. And so, I mean, on a practical level, we do try to balance the SMP tradition, so the liturgy, the tefillot, the tunes. We balance the two, and it's something that our kind of our senior Rabbi Dwight does brilliantly. And we also cater for our congregants who want a more Eastern flavored service. So, for example, on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we offer an SMP traditional tefillah as well as a Mizrahi service. So it's always interesting to see the dialogue between the two, and almost the delicate dance that has to be done between the two. It's very interesting because it makes everyone really kind of dig deep and tap into their identity, and it's something very interesting. And I think it's something that the Western Sephardic ethos lends itself to, because it's so outward looking. It's something that I kind of have adopted and grown to love a lot. The integration of the Western, of the secular, of the worldly into our own practice.
Amazing. I think that's all the time we have for this evening, but I want to thank everyone so much for joining us. And I would especially thank Efrat for sticking it out and staying
Thank
with
you.
us late. We do really appreciate it. She is a very busy woman, as you can see, with so many different amazing roles. I want to thank you all for joining us for our series. Next week will be our last in this part of the series. It will be with Richard Galanti, who is the Chief Financial Officer and Executive Vice President of Costco Wholesale Corporation, who is based in Seattle, who's of Rhodes-Lee and Turkish heritage. Thank you all so much for being with us tonight. Efrat, as always, you're welcome to join us for other programs as well. Welcome at some point.
Looking forward to it.
Inshallah, when the coronavirus
Inshallah.
passed, you're always welcome to come to all our communities in the States as well.
I can't wait.
Everyone, thank you so much for being with us tonight. Efrat, thank you so much.
Thank you.